Wakefield, which is the world's third largest commercial real estate firm. The company makes its money several different ways. It handles large real estate transactions. It has a significant consulting business and also a large facilities management business. So I am responsible for the corporate spend, and I am responsible for a significant amount of client spend as well. So it's very interesting in this role to be on both sides of an RFP. I buy and I sell, and sometimes one at 9 o'clock in the morning and a different one at 10. So this presentation started in its genesis from reverse mentoring that we started at Cushman & Wakefield. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of this concept, but the idea is to pair a younger member of the organization with someone who's more senior and help that senior person learn more about social networking and technology and things like that. So it's being practiced by GE, by Cisco, Hewlett-Packard, a lot of large, very forward-thinking companies. To be perfectly honest, in the case of Cushman & Wakefield, it started with the idea that the cool end of the table would tell the uncool end of the table what they did last weekend, so that I could then go back, because you know what side of the table I was sitting on, so I could go back and impress my kids and impress my friends with how much I knew about the hot places in New York City, which is where we are based. So the reality is it was purely a self-serving, let's spend a couple minutes at the end of the staff meeting, what should we know about New York City kind of thing. But it evolved. So it evolved into some really good technology sharing. For example, someone along the line said, hey, who knows anything about these QR tags? We got a request on the stationery side for one of our divisions to put QR tags on their business cards. What are they and how do they work? And someone raised their hand and said, well, you know, my wife is starting a landscaping business. I just helped her develop a QR tag this weekend. I know how to do it, and I'll coach the group. And so it has evolved into a monthly session where people can post things that they want to learn about, and if someone in the group knows something about it, they help them out. So over time, it's gone from reverse mentoring to what I call parallel mentoring, because it's not just the younger folks helping the more senior folks. I'm seeing an interesting set of observations pass back the other way. Someone who's junior in the group might help someone who's senior learn more about Twitter and you know, why should I ever care about Facebook? On the other hand, the senior folks have been passing some really nice gems of wisdom. So I thought I would sort of consolidate them. And I've been kind of keeping notes, and I thought I'd consolidate them and share 9 of them with you. Now, I'm very visual, and so I'm a visual learner. So there's a lot of pictures and things, and I've often gotten feedback when I give a presentation that people remember some of the photographs or some of the analogies that I've made. So I hope you bear with me as we go through this, and I will share 9 little gems that I've seen go back and forth in parallel mentoring. Number 1, you don't always need 6 people to go to that meeting with you. Have you ever looked around at your staff or looked around at a meeting that you're at and say, who really needs to be here and who's really adding value and who's just here for the ride? Or who's just here because they're part of the team and this is a team meeting and they're sitting there. And something that I have found to be very effective in my organization is to make sure that when a meeting's being held, that there's a reason, a clearly articulated reason for every person who's sitting there. Because we deal with many clients, most of whom are extremely cost conscious. That's why they've outsourced to us. They're looking for us to run their facilities better than they did themselves, you know, for less money. So people are very focused on that in my firm. So I make sure before any of my folks goes on a trip that they can articulate why they're going to be there. So that if a senior person says, why are you 2 there? There's a different reason. They're not just here because they're going to go to the same set of meetings all week long. Now, let me tell you how this came to be. This was a Joanna gem, and this came from a situation I was in personally, where I was working for a company that was in the midst of a large merger. Even though technically it was an acquisition, you know, in those things you never know who's going to wind up on top. And I went to a meeting in Scotland, a procurement meeting in Scotland, global meeting, and I walked into the room and everyone else was sitting there with a team. Everyone else had brought a group of people, and my company in the North American group had sent only me. And I panicked. I looked around and said, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I called my boss back in the US, who was a Texan. And John Adams said to me, Joanna, the motto of the Texas Rangers, one riot, one ranger. And you know, with that kind of attitude, and he kept reinforcing that all along, and you know what, it worked. I went, I was by myself, I managed through the meeting just fine, and in a way it was empowering, because the people who were there with large teams, they had to make decisions at the meeting, they had to make commitments. Actually, in this particular situation, it worked well, because being by myself, I could say, you know, I need to check this, or you know, I have to collaborate with somebody on that one. And it actually, oddly enough, swung, I think, some negotiating power over on our side that we wouldn't have had if I had come with a large group. Now, it doesn't always work that way, right? You need to gauge that, because sometimes you're going to perhaps insult someone if you show up alone and they're expecting a group. But it's something to think about. One riot, one ranger. Okay. Second observation, build alliances. Okay, different from the first. The first one is, it's okay for you to go to a meeting by yourself, or it's okay to send one person on that trip or two instead of 8. Second one, though, is you have to have alliances. And the example we're using here is Starbucks. Something that I didn't realize until it came up at one of our mentoring discussions. Starbucks created an alliance with Pepsi. And that's what brought those little pre-made frappuccinos to convenience stores and gas stations and things like that. Created a whole new distribution setup for themselves, a whole new manufacturing and distribution setup for themselves. They partnered with Kraft to bring coffee to the shelves of your grocery store. Again, Starbucks had the coffee, didn't have the distribution, partnered with Kraft. Those of you who have gone to a Barnes & Noble see the Barnes & Noble Starbucks cafes, right? A place to stop and read the book instead of just sort of kind of sitting in a chair, a place to relax a little bit. And they've partnered with United Airlines. Okay, United serves Starbucks coffees in Starbucks cups to the people who are traveling on their airline. A great way of advertising and getting that Starbucks name around there. The person who used this was using it as an example, saying, you know, well, isolation is really limiting. As procurement professionals, there's not a lot we can influence ourselves, right? In my company, I can influence copiers. I can make a copier decision globally. I can decide on travel kinds of things, but not a whole lot more than that. There are business owners for everything else, and I have to ally with them. I have to make sure that the business owner gets what I'm trying to do, and then I actually get what the business owner is trying to accomplish. So, good example of alliances, and the fact that as procurement professionals we need to do that. Okay. How do you build those alliances? Well, not all of us, but many of us are working for global firms, where you've got offices and people who are out there, you know, all over the globe. Those of you who are working for firms solely in North America, that may look just North America, but you still have lots of dots, I would imagine, lots of points at which somebody can make a purchasing decision. And perhaps, like me, you're sitting with a group of folks, in my case, New York, maybe it's Chicago, maybe it's somewhere where the corporate headquarters is. You've got this, you're talking to the head of HR about a global payroll system, and somewhere in Uruguay, a payroll manager is out there cutting a 5-year deal with the accounting group down the street that's going to cause a problem for you when you go to implement your PeopleSoft system globally and find out that you have to put that country at the bottom of the list. We have to figure out a way, okay, to make that go away and turn into this, right? We've got to figure out a way to get our influence out of our zones of geography into a global influence. And I would suggest to you that there is no substitute for being there. Now, that doesn't mean you have to start transferring people around the globe. That doesn't mean that you have to convince a country manager in Hong Kong to allow you to put a sourcing person there. Necessarily, depends on the size and scale of your business. But I think as procurement professionals, we have to do what we can do to be there, even if it's in a virtual way. So that means if there's a meeting at London at 9 o'clock in the morning, because that's the most convenient for the London team, and you've got to participate by phone and get up at 4 to do it, you need to do it, okay? I've been in situations where there's been very limited travel money. But if you have a travel department, I would bet that the travel manager is aware of credits that might be sitting there, unused tickets that might be sitting there from someone who's left the firm. Airline credits, right now I'm aware that Delta and American Airlines have corporate programs where even if you're buying tickets and you have deals in place for your employees, there are ways that corporations tend to assume points. People often don't want to use them because you can't use your own frequent flyers that way. So it's a good way to get a free plane ticket or to get credits. The reality is, no matter how much there might be travel restrictions, if you are clever, you can figure out a way to get there. You just have to look and and ask, and you'll figure out ways to align with folks. The next example comes from Napoleon. Okay, Napoleon sold the United States a whole bunch of land in the early 1800s, the Louisiana Purchase. What a deal, okay? 4 cents an acre, doubled the size of the United States, can't go wrong. Except when they started mapping it, Thomas Jefferson hadn't gotten what he planned for, right? There's this little issue down here of what was called at the time Western Florida. Very little Gulf side, oceanside property, so to speak, waterfront property. Okay? That was important to the Americans at the time because there were a lot of Americans down there. They all thought they were now part of the United States, and lo and behold, they weren't, because Napoleon, in the fine print, had only sold them this little strip of New Orleans. So what happened? What happened afterwards was the United States embarked on this mission to assimilate Western Florida. Jefferson and James Madison, I think the president after him, sent emissaries over to Spain and to France to try to pick up the territory. They negotiated on and off for a couple of years. There were a couple of revolts, some people wanting to move, some people not wanting to move. And the US occupied a little bit of it for a while. All in all, 16 years of back and forth and negotiating and money being spent and people being spent on year-long journeys over to mainland Europe. The lesson here, unclear negotiations can be costly. Okay, this is one where they thought they knew what they were getting, they didn't know what they were getting, and in the end, took them a long time and a lot of money in order to get it. Okay. A message here: take the time to create a term sheet. Okay, my first boss, my mentor at Johnson & Johnson, Brian McGrath, who was a legend there in terms of procurement, made all of us in negotiations sit down with our supplier partners and create a term sheet. Put in black and white what it is we both think we agreed to. And then compare those sheets and make sure that in the end we came out with a single document that said, this is what we have agreed to do together. Okay? If Jefferson and Napoleon had done that, they would have seen that there was a difference and they could have negotiated it right up front. Right? I see time and time again that we both kind of think different things. Maybe maybe one side thinks it covers this number of users, the other one thinks it's that side. Maybe one thinks it's fixed pricing for a while, the other one thinks that it isn't. Maybe something in the warranties or the liabilities are a must-have for one company and not for another. And it's a shame to get into a situation where you're way down the pike trying to put the final touches on that legal contract, and in the end, encountering delays as a result of that. I think one of the speakers before talked about, a gentleman from Cops, talked about negative comments about moving too slowly. Well, I think this is what slows up an awful lot of stuff. You've already decided, you already want to move ahead forward, and you don't take the time to do this before you get the attorneys involved and start trying to create that legal document. J. Paul Getty said in here, when you're putting that term sheet together, remember his words. You must never try to make all the money in a deal. Let the other fellow make some money too, because if you have a reputation for always making all the money, you won't have many deals to do. And you know, I hear people talk about, oh, I really nailed him to the wall. I really nailed him to the table. We really got something, you know, we really have like squeezed the last. Why? Well, is there not a happy medium? And I know that I have a situation right now with a global head of HR who actually wants a global payroll system and is being very unreasonable in terms of her expectations on what the supplier of choice is going to be able to do. In the end, if somebody has to buy the business, if somebody has to come in with a situation that they're going to lose money on, number one, you're never going to be the client of choice. Number two, you can be damn sure that at the first opportunity, those prices are going to get to a level that's a tenable proposition for that supplier. So I would suggest that his words really make a lot of sense, that it doesn't have to be, it has to be something. You have to be able to step back. You have to be able to understand your supplier situation and come up with something that is going to work equally well so both of you feel really good. If one of you feels bad as the deal is inked, if one of you is in trouble or trying to figure out how he or she is going to make up margin on somebody else because they just lost so much margin on you, maybe it's not a good deal. Okay. Another reason to create a term sheet, I've alluded to this one already. What happens when you start with supplier paper? What happens when you say, well, okay, why don't you send me your standard agreement and we'll go from there? This is what happens, right? This is what it looks like. And we have an attorney at Cushman & Wakefield that we work very closely with. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. But he loves to start with supplier paper. And I keep saying, why? Why don't we do it this way? And I really have struggled to get him to see that maybe in the end, this would save all of us an awful lot more time. Okay. Now we'll talk about style a little bit, right? Everybody has a different style. I had a boss at Johnson & Johnson once get terminated. He was a vice president of operations for a big, well-known, big-name division of J&J. He got fired, and he never left. He just kept coming back to work every day. And the people, he was so high in the company that he had a key to the executive garage. And the guys at the executive garage were afraid to ask him for his pass back. They're afraid to ask him for the key back. He just kept coming. And you know what? In the end, his demeanor was such that in the end, he retired 5 or 6 years later at 65 or 66 years old. He just kept plugging away. And in the end, somebody figured out something for him to do. Okay? Mean works well for some people. Okay? Nice works well for others. You know what your style is. You know if you're demanding, not demanding, whatever. You have to figure out a way to make it work for you. If you're this, don't try to be that, okay? You can, if you are inherently a people person who remembers people's birthdays and sends them birthday cards, that's all right. Figure out a way to leverage that. You'll still get respect from people, both these types of people wind up getting people to do what they need them to do. So, but there are things that come natural to us, and I think all of the books in the world don't necessarily help you move from one style to another. I think you are better off deciding which style you have and figuring out a way to leverage it and make it work for you. Example number 7 starts with the purchasing card. Don't know how many of you have organizations that use P cards, but for my company, it's very helpful because you can imagine that in facilities management, there are tons and tons of low dollar spend. A wrench, a screwdriver, or this or that, that you can't always buy from a corporate deal. What I have found over the years with purchasing cards is that they work really well in the United States. But unless you're a really big firm, unless you're part of a lot of spend, it's often hard to get it to work outside the US because the acceptance isn't there. Not as many vendors accept it. So you have to have enormous spend in order to have a program like that pay for itself. In my case, though, in the US, 40% of our transactions flow through a purchasing card. And they're all tiny little things. So it's vastly important to my organization. And I was desperately trying to get it in and figure out a way to make it work in the UK, which has a similar profile in terms of spend to the US. And I couldn't get it to work. Went back, tried it, did an assessment a couple of years later, nowhere. And then all of a sudden, the London Olympics came. Okay? London Olympics in 2012 set up a virtual procurement organization. I actually have a close friend who is part of that organization. Now the Olympics has a problem, right? They have an immediate problem of getting everything in and getting it in on time and trying to stay within budgets. Then they have another problem on the other side. What happens when the Olympics are over and all those bills come in? How do you set up a virtual accounts payable organization? Well, they decided that they didn't want to. So they mandated that certain types of suppliers, they're high volume, low spend suppliers, all accept the purchasing card. If you want to be a supplier to the Olympics, you need to accept the purchasing card. Well, all of a sudden, guess what? We just did a refresh, and it's a really different animal now. Because now there's a lot of suppliers in the UK that accept the P card. So that very analysis that didn't work 2 years ago is a project that's going to get implemented in a few months for C&W. Okay? The message there, observation number 7, a good idea is a good idea forever. Sometimes you have to let the world change, or the circumstances of your company change, or the senior leadership change. But if you really believe that something is the right thing to do, kind of keep it in your back pocket and go back and pitch it when circumstances change a little bit. Because I can tell you that this will be a wonderful benefit for our firm and for our clients. And if it weren't for this, I wouldn't be able to do it now. Okay. My next example is one that someone on my staff brought up when we were talking about negotiations. And it's an example from Enron. So during the Enron situation, Enron's CFO, Andrew Fastow, refused to testify against Enron's CEO, Kenneth Flay. Wasn't going to testify, and the government really needed his testimony in order to have a locked-up case. Without it, the perception was that they would have a difficult, long process in terms of finding him guilty. Well, in the process of discovery, right, in going through documents and information, what did they find? They found that the CFO's wife, Leah Fastow, had accepted an extremely expensive piece of jewelry from the firm. hundreds of thousands of dollars in necklace or earrings, something like that. And she hadn't declared gift tax. So she was guilty, potentially, of tax evasion. And she was in a situation where guaranteed she was going to have jail time. So what happened? They went back to the CFO, and in exchange for testifying against Mr. Lay, he negotiated shorter jail time for his wife and ultimately for himself. What happened in this situation? People don't change their minds. One of the things that you learn when you go to these negotiation classes is, once someone says, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, they don't change their minds. If you want a different result, you have to change the conversation. The conversation, in this case, stopped being about the CFO testifying against the CEO. It became about the CFO trying to protect his wife and have her serve as short a sentence as possible.